Yeah, record. All right. So everybody, welcome to week 4. We've completed the basics. I am quite glad with the way things are going. First 2 lectures are always broad and introductory. We've dipped into art of ethnography, which is where we start to really take on structure. And now we're really going to start taking bites out of the course material, which I absolutely love. So the thing that I'm sort of going to attack in this section will be ways of thinking. So this is, I guess, broad scale anthropological methodologies for solving problems. How do we make sure that we do? I mean, even though I talk about the difficulty of ethnographic method, how difficult it is to sort of access the idea of truth, we are still looking for truth. Like anthropology is actively trying to get at the basic human nature. So, we need to be able to get as much data as we can. We take for granted that everybody is lying, but at the same time, we need to be able to generate enough information and then cross-correlate it, just compare it and find little bits and nuggets of information that are universal. That's the big task, right? How do we get to human nature? Approach the problem from as many different angles, compare as many different cultures, but also use as many different methodologies. And whatever it is that is truly consistent all the way across everything, that's the stuff that's gold. That's the stuff that we're siphoning out to be able to utilize. It's the stuff that contributes to the science of the process. Thanks to the handful of people that checked me some money. Check me some money if you haven't. Like I said in the email, don't stress too much about it. You can pay some at the end, but it would be nice to justify the time and give me a little bit of a self-esteem boost. But whatever you can afford, don't stress. All right, in this lecture, I will talk about creating a theory of informed research design. So I'll talk a little bit about theory and what it does. I'm not going to go too deep because these next 3 weeks we'll be covering these different perspectives. I want to give you a history of Western embodiment. So the history of the way that we work with embodiment is very much a history of bias. And it's been heavily shaped by a particular sort of background and the way that it's developed in the Western world. I am cognitive anthropologist, medical anthropologist. My last big position was in a children's hospital with stem cell science units. Embodiment is great and important. And it's fascinating for me to see how we're still, like, up until really recently, being stuck within a paradigm that's come out of a particular historical trajectory. So I'm going to address that, talk about that a little bit. I'll give you some of the characteristics of what you call the biomechanical paradigm. That's what we kind of currently live in, but are starting to break out of, which is really important. I mean, really useful to have that paradigm to come from, but also good to be able to break it. Talk about how anthropologists are working with the body, and then talk about how we think with the body. Like, I want to think about cognition as an embodied practice too. And I'll talk about a little bit about the way that culture shapes our behaviors and practices. I'll also talk about all the really cool stuff that we're discovering in the neurosciences related to the environment shaping us. And there's a lot of ways that we can dissect that, which I go into the embodiment course, like I go into in the embodiment course in a lot more detail. But we'll go for the biome because that one's all the rage at the moment. It's lots of fun to play with. The big thing that I also want to do is I have a bugbear with philosophy. I shouldn't. Philosophy is great, fantastic, lots of ethical things that come out. The thing that shits me about philosophy is a great deal of it is trying to come up with understandings about the world through logical systems that we invent. Anthropology has a little bit of philosophizing in it, but here is the thing that I want to adhere to as a field worker and a pragmatist. If a theory doesn't have an application, if it doesn't solve a problem and can't be tested, as far as I'm concerned, it's fun exercise, great wank, not much use. Fantastic in terms of scratching your brain. What I really want to see and want to utilize is the idea of theory as a scalpel. It's the metaphor that I use. So theories, in my opinion, are methods of dissection. They're a tool that allows to open up a social body or a system of understanding, a cultural system, and try to find, its motivations and the mechanics of its practice. They're a tool of exploration, and we need to test the tool, and we test it by putting it to use. So if you have a theory and you apply it and it's not giving you anything in particular, I'd throw it away right away. I wouldn't consider that to be a useful theory. Moving around the thing so I cannot be looking at the corner the entire time. So a theory that is not used in application, that doesn't stand application in the real world, is just a display object. It's, again, a collector's item. It's not what I'm after. And the thing about it is, if we're using a theory and we're behind it and we haven't tested it and it hasn't survived testing, then that means, in my opinion, that makes it dangerous. And a great example of that is you can come up with a billion theories to justify your action. Unless you test them in a whole bunch of ways and they don't survive it, throw them away. Conspiracy theories are a great example. Conspiracy theories are theories that allow you to explain the world and give you immediate satisfaction. But the thing about conspiracy theories is quite often they're fixated on a particular problem and a particular outcome. If you test it across a whole series of fields and then you discover that it falls over, it's no good. Conspiracy theories, I love conspiracy theories, by the way. They're a lot of fun to study. They're a way of satisfying you in delivering an element of closure. So yeah, dangerous. It's dangerous to be able to have a theory that only functions to be able to deliver some level of satisfaction. Theories should be tested. Theories should be verified, and then we can use them as proper tools and technologies to understand the world. And remember too, the other thing about it is a scalpel, when it's not used properly, can also be utilized as a weapon. So tons of example of people generating theories to be able to justify the oppression of other people. You see it a lot in alt-right circles. All you have to do is go on Twitter, formerly Twitter X, and you'll see a million of them. So test your theories and use tested theories, and ideally both. If you have a theory, test it. If that theory comes from a background of being tested, fantastic. You're probably growing and developing something great. It's always a bit difficult too, because we get attached to our own personal theories. They become an element of our identity. It's a good way to make sure that you don't become closed-minded and you really get engaged with the world, if you're willing to throw stuff away. All that stuff about identity and shaking your cognitive triangle applies heavily here. So with that in mind, let's begin with the first thing, and let's think about the way that bodies and conceptions of the bodies can be utilized within anthropology. So beginning with our perception of the body. So the way that the Western world is currently engaged with embodiment is really heavily influenced by a particular tradition. There's this massive history that we draw on and quite often disparage many other forms. And this history sort of becomes, and I hope you don't mind a little bit of historical stuff, it's really important, becomes central in play around the time that Christianity and Judaism has solidified its control of the world. It comes from that kind of worldview. There is a bajillion cults, a bajillion cultures, and a bajillion approaches. But because our written literary culture sort of begins there, we get really excited about these ideas, and we borrow from ideas that were beforehand probably destroying and ignoring a great deal of the stuff that wasn't there, that didn't fit our narrative. So we have a great idea of Plato. Plato was a massive fan of the conception of pure forms. This is philosophy. He just thought it'd be a fantastic thing if you'd be able to reach an ideal of everything. So I don't know whether or not you guys are familiar with the notion of a Platonic ideal. It's a common thing, but Plato had this thing where he's like, there is a perfect version, a perfect ultimate version of everything. There's a perfect version of a chair. There's a perfect version of a human spirit. There's a perfect version of a temper or a type. And that version is so perfect, it has to be beyond the real. Like, he was like, there is this universe outside of everything that has this Platonic center. Like, the closer you get to it, the brighter everything becomes. And his argument was that you can never really achieve it, but you always strive towards it. One of the great sort of metaphors that I love about describing the Platonic idea is that he talks about a candle in the darkness, right? So you've got the dark. The closer you bring an object to that flame, the more illuminated it becomes and the greater it is. But the second that an object is set into the flame, it sets a fire, it becomes immaterial, and it burns. And so this Platonic idea really heavily influenced a whole bunch of other things that were happening around that BC period when the Christians came around. And you had this really huge Christian interpretation of this idea that has to do with the idea of purity and corruption. So the closer to a heavenly sort of otherworldly space you are with this idea of God, the more pure it becomes, the more beautiful and perfect, and the more it connects to the world and the underground and the dark. the more it sort of drifts away, human nature being this imperfect thing. And then you go lower than that, you like enter the demonic realm. So the further away that you get from a set ideal, the worse it becomes. And this is what you call a dichotomous conception. So dichotomous being there's one side of an argument and another, and it's a really big deal. So you have these things that are perfect and fantastic, that are conceptualized as heavenly, and those things are soul, purity, piety, and these things last for eternity. And then you have things that are connected to the earth. So you have the embodied, the corrupt, and what is embodied is vain and it's temporary. So I'm not sure whether or not you guys are seeing. If anybody's willing, I'd love to have some cameras on. Can you guys see the way that this might potentially impact a broad historical conception of embodiment? Anything popping up at the moment, or should I just?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just making me think about often like certain indigenous cultures do have a lot more embodied practices like that are a part of their culture, and those like missionaries would come around and tell them not to do those things, or like thinking about like grieving practices in certain like Aboriginal cultures, like like inflicting self-harm and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. Um, and then obviously the missionaries came and were really like against that because obviously that's not pure or whatever. And yeah, that's kind of coming up for me.
Yeah. I think we lost Oliver for a sec. Sorry. Great point. Exactly right. And the idea of like death, the idea of passing on, being supposedly being this wonderful, pure thing that you celebrate, but people express pain, and it's indigenous cultures, not only in Australia, like it's a really common thing. Like a lot of American Native American cultures do the same thing. The conception of self-flagellation as a form of grieving, the wailing that you see in a lot of African cultures, like this concept of embodying pain and grief, really, really big and important. And yeah, missionaries came along. No, they've moved on to a better place. They're closer to that pure ideal, hopefully. Or in the worst case scenario, they're a really bad person. They're going to burn for all eternity. So yeah, really heavy. These things are heavy, and I love the fact that you mentioned this conception of a missionary perspective, because it is really important to realize that this is not just a cultural alternative. It was enforced, like heavily enforced, initially from Europe, but then through the colonial period, it was just spread out, and everywhere an alternative was encountered, it was not only not well met, it was prosecuted. So, and this is where the next step is. This is the idea of a devil at a crossroad. When you had embodiment as this historically cross-cultural place of healing, expression of grief, quite often social expression, so through dance, through tattooing, through all of these physical practices, and at the same time expression of the psychological, one of the most fantastic things that I've really enjoyed. So I did a topic called the anthropology of trauma, in response to expats, people who had been at war, people who had been deeply traumatized. And one of the things that I saw incredibly valuable was the tradition of walkabout, like the Australian idea of passing grief and processing these processes, processing these big, powerful feelings, feeling disconnected from your place. The Indigenous communities in Australia had this brilliant solution, which is just fucking go. It's a sacred thing that you can do. You disappear for 3 months. It's you walk along and there's a song line that you do, so you actively sing. So even hostile and warring nations aren't allowed to attack somebody on walkabout because they're expressing their sense of healing. And it's this sacred thing where you dislocate yourself from who you were, allow yourself to rediscover what is an essential essence, and then you return to the community as a form of healing. If we had therapeutic methodologies or the space to socially be able to do that with people who are going through trauma in our society, I mean, right now, clinically, there's a million case studies of it being, of variations of that being, as really effective methods of overcoming these things. So we struggle, because we've compartmentalized the physiological process of removing yourself and movement, all of this incredible stuff that's really useful. We struggle with the idea of processing trauma. And there's two big case studies in this. One is, so has anybody heard of eye movement studies for trauma healing? The idea of somebody have, Matthew has. Do you want to do a quick breakdown of what it is?
I don't know really well. I'm booked in for a session next month, so
yeah, it's good stuff.
Starting to experience that, but from what I understand, you're probably going to explain it better because I don't have enough background.
Yeah, sure. If you want to, do you want to give any rough explanation I can expand on, or do you want me to just dive in?
It's like using
EMDR.
Yeah, EMDR, and that you explore a feeling in the body, and that might be associated triggers, and you can clearly sense that in your body, and then it's about doing something where you end up disassociating whatever that trigger is through witnessing something with your eyes and with the practitioner, where you essentially like give it a pathway out. That's what I think it is.
Yeah.
So that you have less related trigger points to that. You won't go and repeat necessarily.
Yeah. So to expand on that, thank you, Matthew. That's exactly right. To expand on that, classic trauma healing methodologies have been psychotherapeutic. So you sit down with somebody, you tell them about the traumatic experience. Now that's a fucked up way to treat trauma, because the thing about trauma is that trauma is an event that has impacted you so heavily that it's absolutely decimated your sense of identity. It's destroyed your sense of self and presence. So one of the things about it, what defines a trigger, is that you can be transported through what they call triggering into the event. Like you can disassociate. It's a sensory disembodied experience that takes you back to that moment. Now, accidentally, I'm not entirely sure about the history of it, because for a little while there, people didn't know why it was working. But somebody conducted a therapeutic process where they had somebody explain a traumatic event while simply following a finger or an object that moved from side to side. It's as simple as that. The methodology is get them to talk while they are having to track with their eye, literally what I'm doing, like holding up a finger and moving from side to side. Since then it's expanded. Like you can hold two objects and they vibrate within a rhythmic pattern. And one of the things that they found is they were able to conduct conversations about traumatic experiences that previously would cause dissociative triggering without those trigger events happening. And for a little while there, people are like, what the fuck? Like, we've been working on this for years. We've tried drugs. We've tried all these different methodologies. Why is it working? The best neurocognitive theory that we've got at the moment is, this is quite interesting, it's what you do when you're walking. As you're walking forward, you are scanning the environment. You can't help it. You don't want to trip over things. It's part of forward motion. And one of the interesting things is, if anybody knows anything about trauma, there's this thing called the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is a way of internalizing that allows you to disassociate from the thing. So it turns out that literally physically moving forward breaks the disassociation that's necessary for you to regress and have these terrible experiences. It's so simple. The way we fucked it up is we made therapy a sitting experience. We made it so that we're sitting and we're contained, which is a fantastic way to give you all the cognitive space you need to make sure that you fuck right off and go back to that traumatic event, whatever it was. So simple ideas like moving forward and experiencing somatosensory things that would happen as if you were moving forward literally glitches out that dissociative experience and allows you to land people into it. And one of the things that's amazing is how effective it is. Because when it first came out, people were like, it can't be that good. And it's been clinically tested a bajillion times and is now one of the most sought after methodologies because you have to be trained in it. But such a simple background theory. It's embodiment. It's the idea of embodied movement. Doesn't allow you to disassociate as effectively. So I don't know whether or not that's helpful, Matthew. That's kind of the underground effect of it. When I was working with people who are in PTSD, I just took them for walks. And I was able to get a bit of funding for an earpiece. So whatever talking was happening, we just did it. Like, it doesn't matter if I'm looking at them, or we're just walking through a natural environment, and you could just talk to people, and people would be able to talk about things without, and people would stop. Like, that's how you know something would be a problem. And because we were doing it in a group, we'd get people to encourage them to put that one foot in front of the other, and it would undercut so much of their disassociative experience. So this is so incredible. And like, this is part of so many what they call shamanistic healing practices. The idea of sway, the idea of rhythmic movement, the idea of it's all embedded within conceptions of traditional healing. And this is so cross-cultural. Like this is one of those wisdoms that's just, it's so effective that you can see variations of it like continents away across very many indigenous cultures. Now, of course, it's a problem because how back before we had all these biomedical understandings, before we could scan brains and understand how things worked, it was considered to be magical. Because the thing about it is, within the belief of the Platonic ideal and the Christian idea is these things were condemned. They were ambiguous. How is it possible that somebody is transforming themselves? There's this idea of a holy God, and he's planned everything for you. So the idea of medicine was something that was actually considered to be bad. Up until like the 1800s, there was this sense of vanity that would occur. Like monks were discouraged from doing exercise. Folk people across Europe and across the world, like when they had their rituals and they had their folk festivals and competitions, those things were considered to be of pagan origins and were heavily suppressed. One of my favorite ones comes from Germany in the 1700s. You would be publicly flogged and fined if you were seen walking on your hands, because it was unnatural and inappropriate. Like we had all kinds of weird, fucked up laws. Like,
I mean, you can see the effects of that even today. If you look at kind of modern Western academic culture, so many of them sit in their offices in their tight-fitting clothing, and this idea of an academic who also exercises is seen as weird.
Yeah. I love that. Men's clothing, the suit, is designed to prevent you from being able to raise your hands above your shoulders. Like it's literally constraining. And the skirt, it's designed to not allow for certain movements. So when I was doing my PhD on parkour, I found one of the things that I wrote about was it's really interesting to see spectruming the way that people are with the idea of parkour practice. Because if you know anything about parkour, quite often it's people running up walls and using public infrastructure to do exercise. Like that's what you do. You're not breaking anything necessarily, not if you're doing it right. And, you're doing wall runs, you're doing jumps and all that kind of stuff. And the more Anglo the culture, the more uncomfortable people get. And I did a comic called Parkour Panels where I'd record it. And it was just this comment, like I had a series of reactions where people would just freak out and be like, no. And the big thing that like when you interview people, and it was hard to interview those people because they were usually really hostile. Like if you're jumping on a wall, somebody's like, get down from there. You can't jump down off the wall and go, why do you feel that way? But the thing that came up eventually is that the idea of physicality is supposed to exist in certain places. It's supposed to exist in a gym or in a sporting venue, and everything else is just not allowed. And then it was interesting because like the further north, like you go to Europe, France is a little bit better. The UK is the worst. America is scary. Like it's actually loitering. Like if you're just exercising on a street, you can get fined. It's a criminal charge. It's called loitering. And then you get to Denmark and people are like, okay. And then you get to Russia and people are like, this is great, like Eastern Europe. And then you get to China and it's like, I thought Russia and China are like these really authoritarian places. But if you exercise outside, people are like, yes, we get it. Like, this is fantastic. So these places that have histories of body culture are way more open to all these democratic liberal things. Sorry, go on, Oliver.
You walk through any public park in China and there's someone practicing Tai Chi flow or these kind of things. But I'm sure you know Stora, the...
Yeah.
Yeah,
I actually know some of those guys. Yeah.
Oh, really?
I'm friends with Callum.
That's awesome. Yeah. But yeah, just the videos of people just yelling at them on the street for doing things, and it's like these are professional athletes.
Yeah. It's so bizarre, and I've got photos from my field study of non-climbing walls where people would just grease the side of a public wall because they didn't want people touching it. It's like, what the fuck? And not only that, but their playgrounds are locked off. Like, you're not allowed to go into a playground unless you're part of a housing commission. It's like, Jesus Christ. Playgrounds! These are playgrounds. Play on the playground. Meanwhile, you go to Eastern Europe and there's public calisthenics, serious public calisthenics gyms in every block. So I quite like it. Not that I want to purport all forms of authoritarianism, but body culture, they've got that stuff right over there. And people can exercise that way. It's great. So this idea that this historical trajectory comes from this idea that God is the one who decides your fate, and working on the physicality of yourself, or certainly seeing, like, performing a cultural practice that involves things like trance or movement outside its designated place. That's evil stuff. We need to regulate it. And we see this huge thing where traditional forms of healing are really heavily stigmatized. Fantastic. There's loads to say about this. and again, we'd have to save it for the anthropology of embodiment, but the history of shamanism, witchcraft, are really, really interesting ones. How heavily people were punished for the idea of doing what is essentially psychotherapy, except in the traditional form, but also using herbs and bone setting as forms of healing. These things were outlawed. Like, you could get burnt at the stake, and in fact, many people did. So this is the kind of tradition that we come out of, and it didn't go away with the invention of contemporary science, because, I mean, everything comes down to a gentleman called good old Rene Descartes, who started to formalize the scientific methodology, but was still really, really embedded in that Christian mindset. Like, if you've ever heard of Rene Descartes, he's the guy who really, really set the idea of Cartesian dualisms, and this is key to the way that we've approached medicine, and still do in a lot of heavy ways. So he proposed that we're divided into the idea of matter, the physical body, which involves and interacts and functions like mechanical hardware. Here we have the introduction of pharmaceuticals. Here we have the introduction of surgical methodologies. Here we have the introduction of broad-scale medicine, as we know a lot of it to this great day, and the mind, which to him was not a physical substance. It was something outside of a physical substance. So equated almost with the idea of the soul that enables thinking, doubt, and memory. And then, the digital and the electronic. We have been breaking that down. We understood that a brain is a very important thing. But even in our treatment of neuroscience and cognitive sciences and psychology, we still thought very much about this idea of matter, the brain matter, and still committed to the notion of soul. Why can't we get to why can't we find and compute consciousness? It must be something outside of us. The reality is consciousness is just, in my opinion, it's a compilation of so much of our physical experiences. I always get really annoyed when people talk about, oh, soon we're going to be disembodied consciousnesses. I don't think that that's possible. I think that consciousness is partly embodied. I think the entire thing is required to be able to generate what is a human
consciousness. I feel like that idea of we're going to be disembodied consciousness and working to that as an ideal is kind of the evolution of this kind of historical distrust of the body.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's also why we can be so weirdly optimistic about things that are obviously not good for us. And my first undergraduate, postgraduate, project was working on early day social media technology, and within a neuroscience lab over at La Trobe. And one of the first things that we found is that we're offboarding. It's cybernetic. And the big thing about it is, if we cybernetically connect ourselves to something digital, we, just like when we learned to write, are losing components, but we're offboarding components of cognitive function. So now because we've got Google Maps, we're not as good at reading maps. Because we've got all these connectivity apps that allow us to look up what happened to our friends before we go out to meet them for a coffee, we get anxious about spontaneous phone calls. We've offboarded a lot of that activity. And it's true that we're processing tremendous amounts of data, but the quality of that data is questionable, whether or not it's the kind of thing that would be forever useful. I mean, we're also seeing massive rises in anxiety that some people will argue are because we're diagnosing it better. Nah, we statistically have gone way past that point. We are actually seeing a tremendous increase in anxiety because of these technologies. And I think the reason why we're uncritical of them is because we still hold on to this idea that, oh, the physical, fuck the physical, who gives a shit about the real world? Let's keep working our way towards this Cartesian, platonic almost purity. Well, if we leave the body behind, great, we're going to be so much better and so much more exciting.
Let's all get into the metaverse.
Yay! The Matrix too. Just plug ourselves in. Yeah, fantastic stuff. Ugh, interesting, weird, but yeah, it's still from this historic trajectory. And so there's so much to unpack there, but it's important to remember where this is coming from. And this is an aggressive methodology. Like, and in truth, it's not evil aggressive. I mean, it's got evil component of colonialism and stuff in it, but the reality is it's also really effective. To treat ourselves as machines, we have gotten better at treating a lot of diseases by treating ourselves as objects that can be taken apart. So, it also comes with a pretty good sales pitch. Come to biomedicine and we'll be able to give you a drug to address a particular issue. We'll be able to do surgery to cure a particular disease. So it has selling power as well. It comes with both a carrot and a stick, which makes it such an effective system for distribution. So This perspective has deeply influenced by Christian philosophy in reinforcing the dualistic worldview and fostering a discomfort with ambiguity. We don't like ambiguity. And that's just the way that it works. It shapes fields like medicine, leading to emphasis on mechanical intervention, where the body's seen as a machine rather than an integrated system of mind and matter. So, yeah, this is called the biomechanical scientific paradigm. It's biomechanical because it's biological machines. And it's got the following principles. The body functions as a machine operating according to universal clinical principles. True, it does. Optimized function is achieved through controlled conditions of input and output regulation. And non-optimal functions, which is when things go wrong, we call it, say, pathology, are treated accordingly. Organic systems are interdependent, but everything is modular. So in other words, everything kind of works together, but you should hypothetically be able to treat the heart separately from the liver and then put them back together. We're like pieces that we can exchange. And, we can do targeted intervention as a result. Each internal systems contributes to this higher elusive, bigger thing that we consider to be consciousness. Previously, we just called it soul. Now we just call it consciousness. We still don't know how it comes together, but we assume it's all the pieces working all at once, and that it's objective and material, and it works. The reality is we can't beat it up completely. It's got problems, but it's really effective at giving us our contemporary medical system. So I'm not here to tell you to go see your local shaman or go get a tarot card reading. Go see a doctor for doctor problems. This system is quite effective by it, but it has its limitations, which is really important for us to look at. And anthropologists have been into this. As a medical and cognitive anthropologist, I've worked in a laboratory. I've worked in all those environments. So anthropology is into it. Forensic anthropology does it. We look at skeletal remains and we understand the history of stuff. Archaeology does it. Obviously, we look at bones and all of these mechanical components. Evolutionary anthropologists, we will look at genetics specifically and the way that we can see epigenetic and mitochondrial impacts, which are all really, really cool to play with. Neuroanthropology, which is what I do, where we are exploring the intersection of brain function and cultural behavior, which is heaps and heaps of fun. What can we see within the brain that tells us something about the culture that it exists in? What components of memory, like for example, song lines, fantastic example, the way that the song lines will actually show in cortical brain scans to influence particular areas over others. What does our brain look like when we engage with a lot of social media? What does our brain look like when we engage in different environments? Part of my PhD was we did some brain scans on parkour people, and we found that a lot of parkour people were using parkour movement to be able to control anxiety. And then we took a broader population and looked at meta-analysis and found that people who live in cities are more stressed out than people who don't. And we're stressed out because we are just exposed to information constantly, and that comes out in the size of our amygdala. So you can literally scan the brain and see the impact of that cultural environment. I think that's really, really cool. And then primatology, looking at the way that our primate ancestors slowly built up this process, the way that our brain comes from particular behaviors. So yeah, anthropology is not just all about hoity-toity, touchy-feely, let's ignore biomedical science. We also totally utilize it. It is a totally valid perspective. And one of the cool things about it is we get to contribute to it. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the way that medical anthropologists have used this biomedical model to be able to prove stuff. So one of the big ones is we kind of broke a lot of the information early on about the dietary impacts of sugar. It's historians and physical anthropologists who are able to look at some of the impacts and how much sugar that we're consuming and the way that it is not good for us in a whole bunch of interesting ways. For a little while there, the sugar lobby, in fact, to this day, the sugar lobby is almost as scary as the tobacco lobby used to be. I don't know whether or not you guys know this, but sugar pays a tremendous amount of money to make the ridiculous argument that calories are the same everywhere. If you're eating a shitload of sugar, one, you're probably not getting terrific nutrition, but two, sugar is addictive as fuck. It is really addictive in a series of ways, and metabolically behaves really similar in terms of the way that our body processes it to alcohol. So eating a shitload of sugar is very, very similar to consuming large amounts of alcohol. Generates addictive behavior, does a tremendous amount of damage to your liver and kidneys, and has really strong neurological components. So anthropologists were all over that, which was really cool. Orthopedic studies on mobility. Anthropologists are the reason why you guys are copying all the ads for barefoot shoes. We were the ones who were doing a whole bunch of experiments in the 90s and early 2000s about what shoes were doing. Nike was not a particularly big fan of it until they got on board and started making them themselves. But the whole idea of a shoe, and it comes from a whole bunch of great studies of the way that Indigenous people run, and particularly hunting. I don't know how many people have been exposed to all of the long distance hunting stuff. Has anybody heard about people running gazelle down? Some people have, some people haven't. One thing that anthropologists discovered, especially observing hunter-gatherers, but also looking at archaeological evidence, is that the original method of killing an animal was not necessarily to throw spears or rocks at it. It was just to run for a really long period of time.
Pursuit predation.
That's it. It's a really big thing. So the reason why is because we're upright, we're able to have a chest cavity that's open, and that means that when we run, we're not compressing it, which means that we can be really long distance runners. If you take any quadruped, when they run, they compress their chest and they overheat because they can't sweat. And all you have to do is just not let that animal rest. And after a while, it'll just drop dead. So people being able to run an animal down and do relays demonstrates that. And guess what? None of those people were wearing Nikes. They were all doing it with a broad-footed, minimalist sort of covering, if any at all. So this suggests that we're not really evolved to have a huge amount of orthopedics, and that's caused a significant sort of reevaluation of stuff. When you think about, like, there's the two great case studies of this is, who do you think has better knees at the end of their careers, ballet dancers or basketball players?
Ballet dancers.
Ballet dancers end up having greater knee resilience, and the reason why is because they learn to land. They're dependent on very minimalist shoes, while as basketball players, they're great. They can get great jumps, they can get great heights, but one of the things that goes really quickly is their knees, because they're landing on massive cushioned shoes. And so it's one of those classic examples of the way that you can see this play out in real time.
Speaking as a ballet boy, first thing I learned was how to bend my knees.
Yeah, learn to land. It's such a big deal. I mean, of course, as somebody who does ballet, you also know that there's a shitload of knee injuries, but it's not nearly as horrific or career-ending a lot of the time as people who are in professional sports.
Yeah, hamstring injuries, non-existent.
Yeah, one of those things.
But yeah, just don't look at their toes.
Yeah, grotesque. You'd have to go back to like 1300s China with the foot binding to see the levels of equivalency. Terrifying stuff. So one of the other things that we figured out is we can see human evolution happening with our ability to adapt to milk. Believe it or not, human beings' ability to digest milk is something that's fairly recent. And all of these people who are like, where's our progress in evolution? One of the things that we get to do is demonstrate the way that our tolerance to milk and lactates is something that we've been able to spread, which is really fun. And then the importance of the microbiome, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So these are things that we get from the biomechanical sort of biomedical paradigm that we can use, which is absolutely great. But the other thing that we do is we also want to disturb assumptions. We want to bring back some of the stuff that was eradicated. So we have an interest in the way that traditional methodologies impact things, and we want to test them. There isn't just this idea that, you know, the magic of the shaman and the witch were somehow inherently good, but we look at the way that these things function and we see what elements of them we can bring in and how we can introduce them to general practice. What is it that makes them effective when they are? Huge fans of the placebo effect. I love the placebo effect. If it fucking works, it works. I don't care about why. If it requires ritual, it requires ritual. By the way, we'll have a thing about ritual and depression 2 weeks from now, and there's some fantastic case studies that are really cool to look at in terms of mental health. But in the previous example, so borrowing from the slide, anthropological research was supported by biomedical studies, leading to new understandings of body function, causal theories, blah, blah, blah. But we don't just examine these individual conditions. We're not looking at them in isolation. We're interested in holism, and we want that big systemic approach. So we compare medical assumptions and pathologies across different cultures, and we question how we define disorders, how we treat them, and how we understand them. Great example of this is a lot of the stuff that we consider to be mental health issues. ADHD is a big one. Right now, we treat it as a pathology, one of the most sought after industries and pathologies that you can have. In other cultures, they're forms of hyperproductivity. Things like the big one, the big scary one, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia that involves dissociative states, high levels of visualization. In some cultures, much worse than us. In our culture, we just consider it to be a brain malfunction and pathology. Tons and tons of cultures involve that with shamanistic conceptions, and that's really fascinating because if you look at cross-cultural comparison, schizophrenia and its worst impacts, things like violence, things like self-isolation, things like self-harm, are often associated with the amount of stigma that society puts on the schizophrenic condition. So it turns out that if you take somebody who's hearing voices and you put them in a positive environment, give them a particular functioning role, most of the time they're okay. In fact, most of the time they're quite productive. And then what you have is all these curious applications where, for example, across Southeast Asia, there are sections where schizophrenia is associated with those shamanistic states. South America has also similar examples. And all of a sudden, a lot of the violent side effects, they disappear, and it's fantastic to see. Meanwhile, you make everybody suspicious of somebody who's already not certain about reality. Turns out that they tend to act out a little bit, and not just a little bit, quite a lot. And again, you see examples where it's highly punitive. And yes, those people are not doing well. When society behaves as if you are a burden, it's really to internalize that stigma, really easy to internalize that stigma and go from there. So, we've done a whole series of meta reviews on all these things like autism, OCD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD, addiction, and dementia. You look at treatment histories and prevailing theories, and you compare them to cross-cultural outcomes and evolutionary frameworks. Why is there so much less dementia in Japan? Questions like that. Why is it that autism is diagnosed in particular regions in a particularly gendered way? Why is it autism is associated with, for example, in sections of China, autism has a connection with masculinity? Is there any validity to that? Yeah, fascinating stuff. When you think about autistic traits, they're kind of what you'd call typically masculine traits. And then we start to explore that. Can we look at that through scans? Can we look at that? We bring the biotech to these cultural differences to try to unpack them as much as possible, which is really, really cool. Yeah, rigid social expectations, huge deals. And also, the increasing prevalence. So we're living through a massive technological state of change, like as big as the Industrial Revolution. And all of a sudden we're seeing certain conditions spike. That's telling us something. These are social indicators that these things are connected not only to internal things, but the social conditions that we live in. And psychology has had a model called the biopsychosocial approach since the 1970s. And it's great. Biopsychosocial approach is fantastic. I mentioned it before, but in application, it barely ever happens because there's limited resources, because it's difficult to get a community behind this stuff, because we've got methodologies that just try to peel things away. So it's important to be able to look at the broad scale. Anthropologists engage with that as much as possible. Do we want to check some questions out? How are we going? We're kind of plowing through quite quickly, covering a lot of material. What do we think of so far? Are we okay to just listen in, or have we got something to check out?
Yeah, you're doing a very effective sales pitch. So it's kind of, my main question is why we're just not doing this kind of meta study more.
Well, increasingly we are. And the big thing about it is this happens more when we get something like EMDR. Like when we get a therapeutic approach that all of a sudden just breaks our prior success boundaries. That's when we start to get traction. But the reality of it is cultural momentum takes a shitload of energy to turn away, especially when it's embedded in economic systems and political beliefs. So going all the way back to the lecture about witchcraft and the way that it was actively prosecuted, the idea of the Christian conception of purity was a cultural system, so it came from a particular history, but it was also political. Peasants aren't supposed to cure themselves. Peasants are supposed to do specific types of function, and this political system was monarchistic hierarchy. So in other words, If you're a peasant, your job is to work until you drop. You're not supposed to be vain. You're not supposed to be all of these stuff. I mean, royalty certainly had doctors. They had the best of what they thought was good technology at the time. But it also has cultural implications. At the moment, we worship this bizarre thing called the economy, which is, as an anthropologist, I'm always weirded out by that, because economy is an abstract system that we invented to make our life better. And I said this before, and I'll say it again, but we will turn around and we'll make an economic argument for why we can't change something. And to me, I'm just like, it's so weird. We invented a deity, and now we're sacrificing people at its altar. Like, it's just like, what the fuck? But that's what people do. It's kind of just what we do by default. So this is part of the reason why it's hard to turn it away. The second that you have a solution that's cheap and effective, that's when you've got really big uptake. And that's why we're seeing, like, I love the fact that we talked about these trauma therapies, because they're blooming, because they're really effective. Another great example, and kids don't do drugs, but all the fascinating psilocybin and LSD studies that are currently going on, and how effective they have been in terms of moving conceptions and as a therapeutic tool. And we've just said no to them because of a series of largely politically motivated expectations about drugs. We just went, drugs are bad because they come from particular social environments. There's a whole history of the war on drugs. And this isn't just lefty political nonsense. This is really well historically documented. I recommend you check it out. But it's preposterous to me that we haven't been able to experiment with these substances in a therapeutic setting until literally, and this is no exaggeration, until 15 years ago. You just weren't allowed to touch it in any way. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it turns out if you're not using it for nefarious purposes, it's actually got really positive application. Well, in the Doi, I mean, that's why shamanistic healing uses a lot of those substances. Not only that, but like, what does psilocybin, what does ayahuasca do? It allows you to dismantle pre-existing methods of problem solving, and allows you to look at yourself from a new perspective. And how much more valuable can you get for a process of trying to transform an embedded system of thinking? It makes sense that under the right conditions, you're able to use that for positive means. And that's what shamanistic practice was. It was always given to you by somebody who was an expert. It came with a particular ritual, and it always had an end goal in mind. You didn't recreate things like alcohol, things like psilocybin, things like ayahuasca, all existed in particular intended uses. We now use alcohol recreationally. We take mushrooms recreationally. We do all these things without that context. So of course we're not getting the same results. And yet we're broad scale painting that as different application. I get excited about that again. Like, yeah, I'm not here to be your dad, careful with your drugs, but at the same time, from a scientific perspective, it's really important to be able to conduct trials and studies on these methodologies. And shocker, they have been recently, and turns out that if you do it right, you get all kinds of positive effects. Do we want to keep? Yep. Go.
Very quickly, I just have an analogy for this, for the modern presence of Platonic forms. I'm doing a neutral mask workshop at the moment, which is a acting methodology, comes from France, Jacques Lecoq, and it's obsessed with this idea of the neutral body, which is it is a Platonic form. It's an impossible ideal that you constantly strive towards, and I just find it so fascinating being able now to identify Platonic forms, and having learnt about them, I'm going, it's that.
Yeah. Everything is loaded with meaning. How can you be neutral? It's an ideal. Yeah. The second that you approach that flame, it burns whatever it is that you're doing. So yeah, I like that. It's a great example. I also, symbology is fantastic in that way. The closest there, people have been asking if there's a universal human symbol, and there is, and it's the simplest thing in the world. It's not a color, and it's not a particular shape. It's the imprint of a human hand. There is not a single culture that does not recognize the imprint of a human hand. It's just one of those universal things. So there's these embodied ideas that we can convey that allow us to communicate with each other, which are just really, really cool. I love that stuff. So anthropological body paradigms, since the 1990s, anthropologists have centered the body in the discussion of self-learning and healing, and trying desperately to move away from dualistic frameworks while still working on them. I mean, depends on your particular thing. So embodiment as a paradigm has not been around for very long, but has been treated as a new methodology, and it's really cool. And it builds on work that previously sort of has been marginalized. Like I gave you Ponti, The Techniques of the Body, which is just a great reading. It's old school. And all it was during the First World War, this guy was observing the reality that people swam, stood, breathed, and acted completely differently. And became aware of the fact that we didn't have this one sort of hierarchical system. It wasn't people at the top who were most civilized who were most effective at stuff. You had this plethora of things that people were doing that were really, really cool. So central to this idea of anthropological understanding of the body was the idea of representation versus experience. So not just looking at the body as an object or a machine or even a symbol of something, but actually trying to figure out the way that people engaged with it. So part of that ethnographic fieldwork, like I told you last time, is to exist amongst people and try to practice their movement, their techniques, engage in their craft, learn the basics of the way that people function. Like, for example, in parkour, you learn 3 basic techniques before you do anything else. You learn to run, because most people don't run properly. You learn to quadrupedal, which is the idea of crawling. Quadrupedal movement is really important and a fantastic body conditioning process. And you learn to roll, which is like a series of movement impact diffusion methodologies. How do you land without breaking yourself from a ridiculous height? You learn to disperse that energy, and that's what rolling techniques are about. But like you go to so many examples depending on what people are practicing, like people who are climbing incredibly well within particular environments, people who are excellent at breath holding. Like there's a bunch of Pacific Island and Southeast Asian places where people are incredible at breath work. Like all of these basic things, they're experiential. You need to be able to practice them, and there's all kinds of great stuff that happens. There's a wonderful book, and the title escapes me, which is really annoying. And it's about breath. I'll see if I can find it and link it for you guys. And there's this guy who basically did a whole bunch of work on breathing. He's a journalist, but he ended up pulling a shitload of anthropologists into stuff. And just the way that we breathe heavily impacts our palate, our jaw health, all of these secondary components. I can't remember it's actually quite good, but it's a popular fiction. I'll see if I can link it. Breath something shit. It's not on my bookshelf because I think I bought a digital copy of it. I'll link it and see if I can find a reading from it. It's great stuff. The other thing is perception, not just the way that we move, but also the way that we see is culturally and movement conditioned. So it's all filtered through cultural methods, but also you see things differently through different forms of movement. Quadrupedal movement brings you closer to the ground. One of the weird things that happens to you if you train movement techniques like parkour is you get really obsessed with, weirdly, the texture of walls. I love a good wall now. Like I'll quite often come up to a wall and just have a feel because I'm just like, ooh, this would be just really nice to step on. Like there's this different perception. You look at, and there's a thing called parkour vision, where you suddenly look at the environment in terms of opportunities and lines of movement, which is just really, really cool. But at the same time, appreciation of grace. So the way that a lot of athletes suddenly can pick people in their own discipline, being able to see somebody who's a runner, if you're doing running, being able to see somebody, like you can just go, that person definitely does that thing. And you can do it with complete confidence because their embodied practice demonstrates that, or this is built for someone because, oh, I can see so much potential within that. Like it's actually a perceptual change as well if you think through it through the physical component.
I can pick a ballet dancer on public transport from a mile away.
Yeah, it happens. I remember a friend of mine, because I did a big section of my PhD barefoot because it was part of proving that physicality component. And you can pick a minimalist. Like I could just look at somebody's gait and their calves and say that person is a barefoot runner. And I remember being out there with my friends and they're like, bullshit. And I'm like, I'll spot 3. And they went and they asked them. And it was like, it's just, you just know from the way that they carry themselves that this is something that is movement oriented, which is really cool. And then the idea of an embodied subjectivity, which is really cool. If we begin with the lived world of perception phenomenal, our bodies are not objects to us. Quite the contrary. They are integrative and essential perceiving objects. There is a thing called phenomenology, which I absolutely love. It's great fun, and it's got a neuroscience component to it, which is great. But within it is the idea that the more you understand something, the more it breaks into components, and the more you end up seeing. So embodied movement leads you to engage with the environment in a tactile way, which leads you to subcategorize. So somebody might see wood, but you'll subcategorize that into 4 different forms of wood if you regularly engage in wood crafting. Like the world becomes more complex and the world becomes more broken down, which gives you more information about everything that you deliver. And that's just such a great, fantastic part of anthropology, of embodiment. So that embodied practice is a way of generating knowledge. Being hands-on with things is spectacularly important. Hands-on, feet on, yeah, tongue on, taste, all of these components, sound, like they all generate expertise and nuance, which is just a great way to get information about the world and also understand the priorities of a cultural group. It's biomedically important for answering the question, what is human nature? But it's also really important in being able to pin down the priorities of a culture. How much do they see of this object and how embodied it is? And yeah, it can be scary, because if you're an anthropologist of embodiment, you look around at people and you start to get worried when they are disassociated from their bodies. So much empathy is based in kinesthetics. There's a thing called kinesthetic empathy. If you want to get through to a group of people, it's those really lame exercises that people use as icebreakers that are really effective, where somebody does a movement and then everybody else repeats those movements. They're not just silly, they generate incredible amount of bonding. And it's usually people who are deeply non-physical who are really uncomfortable with those. And I would recommend you challenge that idea, because yeah, we're all physical at the end of the day. We all have these bodies. It's the thing that unifies us. Am I sounding too rhetorical? Questions? Anything else? Richard and Matthew, you guys have been pretty quiet. Sorry, Ella, not that I don't appreciate it. I'm just giving other people a chance.
I've just been thinking about climbing, like, because I'm a rock climber, and it's just one of those things that's extremely like embodied, and yeah, also one of those things where you can really, you notice that people that are climbers engage with like a cliff or like a natural place like in a totally different way. Even just like, noticing a boulder and like, they are thinking about how they could make that climb or that kind of thing. It's interesting how when people go into those sorts of practices, it kind of changes them. But I was also thinking about how, like, when I've seen children climbing, they're often quite like naturally talented at it. I think it's partially like the distribution of their body weight, but also just the fact that I think they're a bit less maybe like trained to be super like bipedal. They're a bit more fresh from crawling around on all fours, which maybe helps them in some way, which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, when with both of our kids, we did the Adipas shoes, which are like sock shoes, and just encourage them to crawl on every kind of surface. And it's just so effective. It works better for their walking later down the line too, because they're developing this whole new layer range. And sometimes if you chuck kids into relatively dangerous environments with good supervision early on, it's a lot less dangerous for them in the future. At least I firmly believe it. People with that competency, they tend to know how to fall and they tend to know how to recover. And that's an important skill. Really, really good stuff. Anything to check out, Matthew, or are you pretty good?
No, I'm following, but I suppose like a reflection is like on Sunday, and then my mate turned up with his partner and their 3 kids, and the littlest one was 2, and he is phenomenal.
Yeah.
In his movement.
Yeah.
And they just it's like a mini gym, but and so they just kind of worked out, the kids were playing, and he had them like 4 models of behavior, and he was doing all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
And like, even like just when he grabbed his little trike, he'd like rip along, and then he was throwing his like balance control and getting these big turns out of it, and it was just like, it's not, like And I just, my mate, I said, sometimes I wonder what they're thinking. He says, they're not thinking, they're watching.
Yeah,
And
I would agree.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things is also it's interesting to see the way. So this is habitus. We're about to hit that next. Kids have a squat that every athlete can only envy because they spend less time sitting because your body postures then end up rigidifying. Your range of movement is defined by how much you move, and kids are just they come out elastic. They bounce. So you get any kid before the age of 4, and they will do a perfect heel flat squat like it's the most natural thing in the world. For any adult to do that, like it's biomechanically so like you need good levels of flexibility, and it's exhausting. But they've got none of the preconditioning. They've not been told that they've got all. That's a fresh new thing out of the box. Their body's ready to go, and there's no limitations on it. So there's just one example. Like I've seen professional athletes who are just like in awe of the way that kids squat. And yeah, sorry, go on.
And Alex, with the going back to the thing Richard was talking about with the kids climbing and just being able to do it so naturally, do you think that would be in a similar vein to this idea of once you start writing, you limit your brain's capacity to process knowledge in a certain way, or like?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's that, but it's also facilitated by the fact that their tendon strength is proportionate. Like they haven't lost any tendon strength, so their grip strength is phenomenal. Like it's one of those common things doctors used to do, and then you can still do it where they test the instinctive grip strength of a newborn, and they will hold themselves up. So for a little kid, their tendon strength is it's scary. So they've got a lot of control in that sense. And it's not until the fear kicks in. And the interesting thing about that is we've got now so many examples. Like it's just a well-known thing that the fear doesn't necessarily come from the actual activity. It comes more from the reaction that adults impose upon that activity. So kids tend to get scared of scary things, not because they're scared of them, but because some adult comes along and goes, and models the freak out. And that they respond to that really well. My son loves spiders, because, kids are basically human experimentation without ethics for an anthropologist. So since he was really young, every time there was a spider, I'd be like, oh, check that out. And we used to play games where well, if I'm driving and he's sitting in the back seat, I would do a thing where I'd run my hand along the top and I'd be like, this is the spider. And I'd tickle him and stuff. And he's grown up to absolutely love spiders. And a lot of people are reflexively afraid of them. And he doesn't get it. Like, he's just like, why? There were some girls in school today. They were like saying, spiders are scary, Dad. Why are they scary? And I'm like, they're not scary. They've just, those kids have been exposed to the idea that they are. There's instinctive caution. That is one thing that is absolutely true. Snakes and spiders, there's an instinctive reaction of caution, but that caution doesn't have to be fear. It can also be one of the great examples is how excited Indigenous people are about snakes. A lot of Northern Territory Aboriginal communities, they keep an eye out for snakes, and if they see a snake, that's dinner. It's delicious. Like, whoa, look at that, check it out. And if you've ever seen something interesting, it's a 50-year-old auntie, like an old Indigenous lady, who just picks up a tiger snake by the tail and just whacks it against the side of a tree, and then just hangs it over. And it just keeps on walking. It's sorted out. Really cool to see that kind of behavior. So yeah, there's a lot of conditioning. It doesn't necessarily come from the movement or the activity. It comes from the reactions that people impose on it.
And I mean, the one more thing on kids, it's that thing: never put a child or a pet or a dog on stage, because the audience will just watch them because they're completely instinctual. There's no social conditioning there.
Yeah, which is fascinating. It's breaking all the boundaries and expectations, which is great entertainment most of the time. Yeah, so here we have this idea of the cultured bodies. So in anthropology, the body is not seen as a mechanical separate from cognition and perception. It's a living expression of culture. That's what bodies are for anthropologists, shaped by the environment, by habit, and by social structures. So Marcel Mauss's observation is absolutely classic, and what he talks about is this idea, and this is 1920s. This is early stuff. The idea of techniques of being deeply engaged in cultural forms. And we've expanded on that. It's really cool. So like the idea of the Asian squat, right? Like we just spoke about babies. within Southeast Asia, you see people maintaining that perfect squat all the time. I did a year field work in Japan, and you'd see truck drivers just hanging out smoking, and they'd just be heels flat on the ground squatting, because that's just what they do within that particular context. It's never been, the chair is not that popular. A lot of people in Japan still sit on the ground in tatami. And so that mobility is really readily available. It's really cool to see, and it generates that habit. Diaphragmatic breathing, so fucking important, and would solve, and this is one of those things. It's like the way that doctors talk about exercise. I will complain about the fact that we've lost our capacity to diaphragmatically breathe, and it comes from Victorian expectations of decorum, because it's rude in our cultural context to stick our tummies out. And diaphragmatic breathing is all about breathing with your stomach, so it's unsightly. You're creating a pot belly when you're doing diaphragmatic breathing. So we're told to breathe with our chest, which is not, the chest muscles are not the main muscles for breath control. And what you get is this really interesting, and this is absolutely verified by a bajillion studies. What you're doing is you're creating hyperventilation. You're creating a shallow breath. Sorry?
Mirroring Aussie males.
Yeah. Yeah, you've got
to warm up in the chest and shallow breathing.
Yeah, you got to be breathing through the chest and sucking your tummy. I mean, that's a great way to generate it. First of all, good way to generate anxiety and aggression. Second of all, terrible way to actually utilize your breath. The way that we breathe most effectively, we can't sleep without diaphragmatically breathing. The second, even the most trained Aussie male who's afraid of sticking out his stomach will, if he's really relaxed in his sleep, just breathe diaphragmatically, because that's our relaxed state. And being able to, like, I have high blood pressure. If I want to be able to lower my blood pressure, I consciously breathe through the diaphragm, and you can control your heart rate. This is not magical voodoo. It's a simple endocrinic function, and we just don't do it because we culturally have been talked out of it being effective. I had to be
culturally talked back into it by an acting teacher.
Yeah. Breathe through your diaphragm. It's really important. Yeah, and vocal control. You get better vocal control.
And there's a bunch of different breathing techniques in acting, and some of them actively encourage rib breathing rather than diaphragmatic. And I've always been like, but I can't breathe.
Yeah, maybe that's the effect that they're looking for. I mean, think for one of the great, I did boxing when I was a teen and for quite a few years. And the idea of breath control is really important in that too. Being able to hyperventilate at the appropriate time in order to be able to control anxiety, breathing out with a punch. All of those kinds of things come in really handy, and they're really effective for body function. I'll skip the Balinese masculinity, but this is the wonderful thing. Why are Scandinavian women so tall? Anybody want to venture a guess? Long history of participation in physical activity. Really, really intense physical activity, which then generates an epigenetic selective process, which means that Scandinavian women were never convinced that they have to be frail and sick. And over generations and generations, you have really tall, robust women. Like all of this kind of stuff, that's a cultural narrative. In the meantime, if you look at Victorian England and France, they had a thing called the consumption glow. Consumption being tuberculosis. It was sexy to look like you've got tuberculosis, which is kind of fucked up. This is an amazing series of writing about it. Like the Smithsonian Institute, hopefully it'll still be around after Trump is done with it, has a whole series of things dedicated to this idea of the consumptive glow. The idea of dilated pupils and a sweaty sheen while being deeply pale. That lady is dying, but she's hot according to those standards. That's apparently what we're looking for. It's bizarre. So you have, and over generations, you have these things that generate phenotypical distinction. So that makes them physically different, which is fascinating stuff to look at. So bodies are stories and displays. And you have to consider the way that we move our bodies and impact and perceive through our bodies in relation to ecological impact, physical environments, lifestyles, movement patterns, dietary habits, everyday rituals, how we sit, how we do all these stuff, and cultural expectations. So, postures, don't stick out your tummy, what's rude, what's not rude. All that kind of stuff is really important. And this is all really, really dynamic and important to anthropology. Why do we have so much constipation? Because we sit to poop. We'd have less of it if we squatted. but it's unseemly and we don't like the smell of our own poop. Yeah, cultural expectation. Hey, do we want to change it? I don't know, but we'd probably have better digestion as a result. And then we look at, I was a really big fan of Pierre Bourdieu. I cited the crap out of him in all of my work. There's all these ways of being that are also embedded within our environment. So parenting and visual cues, we kind of necessarily covered it. The idea of showing our children that we should be scared of particular behaviors and expectations in terms of the way that we set things up, people being welcome or not welcomed to different environments. And also like parenthood, like it's bizarre. Within the West, we are deeply interested in the idea of making every parent as guilty as possible about everything that could possibly happen. We've got this nuclear family conception where it's like everything that happens is wrong. If it's wrong, then it's your fault. If it's good, it's your fault too. So you better make sure that this human being is controlled to a tiny T. Impossible. Like we've got all these genetic components, we've got all these environmental components. Parents need to chill out. I mean, they're important, but they're also not the center of the universe and they're not gods. This platonic idea of controlling every component of everything, like, yeah, it ain't the best way to go. So our habitus is the culmination of all these things. Our habitus is the way that our body generates our outlook, frames our tastes, frames our physical capacity, and also very much just defines the way that we perceive and understand the world around us. It's the embodied understanding of the world, whether it's specialized knowledge or its behaviors. It's our postural expression. It's central to our cognition. It's central to the way that we cognate broadly, like in terms of our capacity, our diets, our environments. Phenomenology, again, is fantastic for the fact that it's presented the following idea, and I mention it all the time, but I think it's just so cool. The very idea of how far we can see. If you sit around in a place that has close proximity walls, you are more likely to be introspective. If you sit around in a place that has a broad horizon, you're much more likely to be extra perspective. And all of those things generate cultural archetypes. Like all of these things are all physical embodied components. They're perception based, they're cultural based, and they come out in embodied experience. So the other way that this also plays out is this idea of politics and the way that we generate control. So this is now going to good old Foucault. Our bodies are not just biological entities, but they're sites of political influence and social control as well. So this is us starting to understand the way that these systems fall into cultural and political processes as well. So they're expressions of personal power. Foucault is amazing. If you can bear long-winded French writing, I strongly recommend it. But if you can't, there's a million readers. Fantastic theory, really, really interesting stuff. He talked about this idea of biopower, which is the way that we harness in society, the way that we harness human bodies to generate productivity and a sense of control, which is just really, really cool. And he talks about the way that we control things through defining social norm and regulating the shape of bodily autonomy. Like if you can get people to embody your conception of control and power, you generate so much more effective in terms of methods of control than anything else that people can do. And it's really, really cool and really interesting to see. This is the thing that he proposed as a way of body power, like the way the bodies are used as a political method of control. So once upon a time, we had a thing called force and punishment. Really difficult to do and really expensive. You got to catch people, then you got to come up with creative ways to just like punish them. You can beat them up, you can put them on a rack. We had this whole era where we got really creative. Like we'd put them up in a really public place and we'd draw and quarter them and we'd hang them. Not very efficient. People get scared, you get a few, but the reality is, people still try to get away with it and hope that they don't get into trouble. They try to avoid that kind of thing. And then we had this thing that happened where we got really compassionate for a while. The humanist era came through. I mean, this is like the 1800s onwards. We were just like, let's be nice. Everybody's a special individual. Probably a rude thing to do to like put a rat on their stomach and get it to eat their way through the intestines in public. We can probably do a better regulatory method. So we started to do these things where we decided to guide behavior through structured oversight. Shame is a much more effective way to be able to regulate a society. And how do you enforce shame? Well, you generate the idea of being watched. Now, here is the thing. It's really, really hard to watch everybody at all times. And one of the things that was being really heavily philosophized at the time was does somebody actually have to watch you to be able to have the desired effect of behavioral alteration? Has anybody heard from outside of this class about the idea of the panopticon? Somebody has? Oliver has. Yeah, we've got a handful of have. Yeah. The idea of a panopticon, just to summarize super quickly, is a prison in which every single cell, and there was actually one built in South America, which is fantastic. So we get to see it happen. It's the idea of a prison where every single cell is facing out towards a central guard system. Now, the guard tower is either blacked out or the windows are too small to be able to see inside. And there is a guard in there, hypothetically speaking, and he might be looking anywhere at any given time. So what it does for the prisoner is they never know when they're being observed. And within that scenario, what you have is this really interesting series of behaviors where people start to act as if they are constantly being observed. Really fantastic, because after a while, you might not necessarily need a guard in the tower. What happens is you have a system of regulation where people start to day embody the conception of being in tight control. The observation becomes self-inherent. And then what you have is this incredible process by which you have next steps of transformations. You assume that you're constantly being watched, and then you start to perform. You begin to perform the role of one who is observed, and then you begin to internalize the role that you are performing, which is fascinating because this constant performance for an unseen audience is driven by a fear that you get caught out on doing bad things. And after a while, you start to internalize it and you start to impose the consequences on yourself. The performance becomes self-punishing. Sorry, go on, Matthew.
Did they intentionally do that, or this is an outcome of like setting it up like that?
So this was an outcome of setting it up that way. The original conception was that we can make sure people behave because they don't know when they're being watched.
Yeah.
But the reality is when people don't know we're being watched, you have all these cascading effects. So now embodied conceptions of performances, what you get is a sense of social expectation of conformity means that they become their own disciplinary force. And this is fantastic. So panopticon is like the most literal example of this. But one of my other favorite examples is there's social structures that revolve around this idea. Japan is a fantastic example. I did some fieldwork there. In Japan, kids are barely disciplined by their parents, which is counterintuitive. Like you'd think Japan is this really heavily disciplined structure, but kids are before school are fucking wild. I taught English as a means of for young kids as a means of paying my way through my research over in Japan. And their kids are crazy. They don't take instruction. You basically are managing them as much as possible. But what happens is there is a point in their life where they enter a social role and it's the other kid's job to pull them into line. And you see overnight transformations where you have kids who are just the most outgoing, gregarious kids. They hit that like early high school, like late primary school phase. And all of a sudden society, their peers are the ones who are interested in getting them in line. And it's this like cascading knockdown effect system. They enter school, the school system monitors them and encourages them to take control over different levels. They are responsible for the younger kids below them, and they internalize this role. And you have this panopticon thing where the enacting of adulthood becomes a method of disciplining others. And there's harsh bullying, and the consequences of falling out are harsh because kids are literally doing it, but it is so much more effective as a disciplining measure. You get this incredible sense of uniformity, and it's this process of self-policing, which is identity construction. Being able to generate who you are is now a disciplinary tool. And the outcome of that is that the people become the warden inside the watchtower. They are now self-regulating and regulating others around them as a method of discipline. And how much more efficient and effective is that as a method of controlling large population than punishing each one person who steps out of the way? What you now have is a habitus of compliance. And this is something that happens in so many cultures. This social pressure is generated to be able to produce this sense. And then what you have is judgment and enforcement. You will see people within society to go through this process and they dictate. External forces original ideas of what is right start to dictate of who conforms and who deviates. And the example that I have there, and there's a great case study of this, is, you know, reality television. We love watching reality television so that we can morally judge and just assure punishment or success for people who are behaving in the appropriate and inappropriate way. This particular study was about The Biggest Loser, and the way that The Biggest Loser was this big narrative about success and failure. And all of the people were like, it was really important for the viewing public to be on side with somebody as long as they showed the right contrition for their terrible fatness. Like, oh, good, you know, they're a fatty and they're suffering and we want to see them suffer. And this spoke a great deal about what is expected of body norms. Like, the audience was acting as punishment, and the people on the show were just endlessly flagellating themselves. Like, this idea of physical conformity, a really big component of it all. And the scary thing about this is, well, we've got a pretty effective panopticon going on right now with social media. The idea of self-representation, the idea of presenting others like, oh, so many people are suffering from FOMO. So many people have really ridiculously unrealistic expectations. Really, really interesting stuff. How did you guys feel about that? I just condensed about, Jesus Christ, it'd be like easily 25,000 pages worth of social theory to go through all of Foucault's like history of sexuality and then body and sort of capital control. Does this make sense? And is it interesting? Can you think of the way that this might apply, or have I just completely confused and bored everybody here?
No, that's fascinating. I mean, I think I'd have to consider it for a while and kind of look around and see where it applies, because I feel like once you start noticing it, it's everywhere. But yeah, I think social media and yeah, the social media thing and the presenting this idealized version of the self resonates a lot with me. Just because I know, and but also just I see it in the industry that I'm in as well. This idea of the acting resume and headshots and all those kind of things. Again, the idealized self.
One of the interesting things about this is, if you want to pay attention to it, is the conception of virtue and guilt. How many people are willing to completely neglect elements of themselves that are innate, whether it's personality-wise, orientation, or creativity, whatever else, for the conception of not feeling guilty in terms of comparing yourself to others. And it's interesting because, you know, we have all these narratives about self-esteem and being true to yourself, but the reality is stigma is real. We can talk all day about how, you know, you be you, but you are not always, you're going to encounter resistance if you're behaving not in accordance to the appropriate thing. And remember, the Foucauldian theory, the reason why this idea was developed is to talk about discipline. It's about disciplining bodies and discipline as a methodology of control. So it's embodied methods of control. These things become unconscious. We feel shame unconsciously. We do grooming. We do particular, like, how powerful must this be that it talks us out of a natural way of breathing? We learn to breathe with our ribs, and then we forget the most obvious natural way for us to breathe with our diaphragm. And that speaks to tremendous amounts of regulatory power. Like, that's powerful.
You've seen the summary of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer?
I don't think I have.
Deviation from the norm will be punished unless it's exploitable.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like it. Yeah, that's right. If he can guide us through a snowstorm, we'll let him get away with it. We'll call that a special talent. And then all the other reindeer can feel bad about the fact that they don't have a glowing nose. We'll go from there. They'll come up with an artificial way to do it. Yeah, so keep an eye out for it. It's discipline. It's quite fascinating. So going there and exploring all these fun ideas and alternatives, anthropology and poop transplant, we were the people who discovered the idea of the microbiome. I wanted to talk about this because I mean, the case study that I was going to put here is shamanistic practice. And shamanistic practice is kind of fun and sexy, but I've got a whole lecture later on shamanism that I'd rather roll out, and it'll be a lot more fun. It's more fun to talk about shamanism in contrast to the workforce than it is to talk about it in relation to medicine. But shamanistic practice is really interesting and important. One of the things that we're discovering is how embedded our processes of cognition. The reason why I want to talk about biome and biomic structures is that this is one of those things that's coming out of the idea that we used to think that cognitive impairments, like cognitive illnesses, depression, anxiety, all of these things were just entirely within the brain. What we're increasingly seeing, and poop transplants were fun because they only came around fairly recently, is how deeply embedded and embodied they are. Our diets and existent states of biome are really, really big deal. So it's really, really cool to see that, this demonstrates the idea. By the way, has anybody heard of FMT, poop transplants? We all know about it. It was all the rage because it was such a bizarre thing. And it was one of the early sort of exploration of what defines biomic gut health. The idea that you can introduce a foreign biome into someone's digestive system and see immediate reduction in inflammation, see immediate increase in their digestive capacity, but then all the secondary stuff related to mood, it really, really, really cool. And really connects to this idea of speaking. It's not compartmentalized. The biomedical sort of conception of compartmentalized elements don't work nearly as well as we can. The big thing that I'd like to say is it's great because it's designed for the laboratory, and within the laboratory and the experimental model, you can see all these things. It's great for coming up with those mechanical solutions. But if you look at everything as an integrated system, it just becomes really, really cool to be able to see. So how does it work with this idea of thinking with the body? So neuroscience and neuroanthropology, and anthropology itself, increasingly challenges this idea of a top-down idea of neuroprocessing towards understanding the entire body as the processing system. Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist, was one of the first to propose this idea of embodied cognition. And I love this guy. I teach him in the anthropology of the body. He's one of the figures that I dedicate like a full lecture to. And his argument was, and this guy's a neuroscientist. So when he was saying this back in the 90s, people were just like, this guy is fucking out there. But now all of his stuff is being really proven. So the body functions as a connected whole with a peripheral nervous system activity influencing a central nervous system processes. And this just absolutely challenges the idea that the brain sits here and controls everything, the way that Descartes said. The spiritual core, the driver who's up at the front, is not just operating the machine. The machine quite often generates feedback, and then that impacts on the body. So this is great for gut biome, but also you fucking tell me that if you fractured your toe and you are in constant pain every time you step, or you can't move or leave the bed because you're in too much pain, that's not going to fucking impact your mood. Of course it's going to impact your mood. It seems so bloody obvious, and it's really important. Consciousness exists, and this is the Damasio idea, within this embodied mindset. Pain is something that comes from the body and then influences the way that we perceive and function. So brain operates within various body states. The way that he described it is almost like experiences that color our perception and then influence the way that we see the world. Shaped by endocrine symbols, so that's all of our hormonal processes, and which set the parameters for higher cognitive function. It's not like we've got a little guy who's disembodied. That little guy is in pain. That little guy is as aroused. Horny decisions are different from non-horny decisions. Painful decisions are different from non-painful decisions. These are all body states. They're endocrinic functions and electronic communication. So it's really, really cool to see. Subjectivity emerges from two interlinked processes appearing in real time. So this is what he says. A continuous, unconscious bodily self-monitoring. So it's tracking our physical disposition relative to internal and external changes over time. Really, really cool. So it's this constant process of us unconsciously being aware of everything that's happening, and a central nervous system process of decoding, sorting, and narrating, forming thinking and feeling self, where cognition and intuition are mutually influential. So everything that we think is logical is existing within this secondary system. It's those two things. That's what subjectivity, our sense of self, where we come from, how we feel, how we process. It comes from a combination of those two things. And if you're a phenomenologist, and I know that Oliver is a fan, there's an additional component to it, which is our ecology, the environment, and our perception. So for Damasio, this neuroscientist, we think with our entire body, because the higher cognitive processes also are colored by our physical experience, but you can go a level further than that and actually say, well, why is it that it ends at our skin? Quite possibly it ends at our perception. What we perceive is one of those influential things. And that's what the phenomenologists think. And I also think that's a brilliant idea. I think it's it's got a lot of truth to it, because where we are is also what we see, what we're looking at is really effective. When I was recording lectures, I had a lot of trouble speaking to the camera with any level of honesty. Like right now, it's helping me to look at your faces because I feel like I'm having a conversation with you all. So I did an old trick that one of my lecturers recommended, and I stuck a photo of my kids just above the camera. And so being able to talk to my kids allowed me to rediscover the warmth and being able to be personable. While as if I was just looking at a fucking camera, a camera lens, like who am I talking to? If I ever do any interview podcast or anything like that, quite often I'll just say, can we just have it so that I'm talking to you and the cameras looking at us third person style, because talking to a camera is, I don't have the acting skill to be able to pull that off with any level of conviction. I need a face. And that's outside of me. That's outside of me. That's influencing my cognition. It's influencing my expression. That's environmental. It's really, really cool. So sensory perception occurs through two distinct pathways. Direct signal processing of stimuli. So that's how do we process the world? Well, one is if I pinch myself, I feel it. If I taste something, I taste it. Like that's one thing. And then there's this multi-sensory awareness of the act of receiving those signals. So this idea of body image. So we then contextualize all of those signals and put them into place, which is just, I love this kind of stuff. Like this is what anthropology of embodiment talks about. It's not just the brain and then everything else functioning. It's everything functioning in unity and influencing and cross-promoting each other, which is great. So the body acts as a central element in the processing of information and is the ecology, the environment within which the mind operates. Just like we are susceptible to influence from the environment called heat, threat, arousal, comfort, the mind is influenced by our body states that are processing sensory information from both inside and outside the organism. We are connected to the world around us. Nearly 2 decades of research have lent support to this idea, most recently understanding of mood control, inflammation, and regulation of the gut biome and the vagus nerve, which is really, really cool. And this is the final slide, so we'll have a little while to decompress. But there is just this explosion of research on the biome and the vagus nerve. So I just brought a bunch of papers forward. We think with the gut, and some examples are gut biome in relationships to PTSD. It's really cool. People took people with post-traumatic stress, really heavy PTSD symptoms, put them on a Mediterranean diet, and saw a reduction of both stress and inflammation. Simple and straightforward. The kind of stuff that used to really piss people off because we used to have these really strictly cognitive sort of approaches. Turns out both exercise. Oh, I could go on about how great exercise is for all that stuff too, like the physical activity for mental health. Really, really important. Tons and tons of studies to the point where people almost don't talk about it anymore because it's so taken for granted. So gut and reward pathways. This is where sugar is a massive component. One of those things that anthropologists got really excited in. Different foods will actually really heavily affect your motivation, broadly speaking, not just within food gathering, but also motivation in terms of broad scale activities. Another series of fantastic studies. Certain foods simply create narrowed down motivational pathways, simultaneously a broad scale gut biome. Certain diets will allow you to have more energy. Anybody who's an athlete will tell you that right away. If you have physical activity, your diet immediately starts to change. But it also has to do with the way that we process things, which is really, really cool. All kinds of interesting stuff about, this is part of what you'd call the poop transplant studies, but also what you'd have as neurogenesis. So preservation of cells within your brain, being able to offset the age of forgetfulness and all the secondary things that come with aging. You have higher levels of neural density if your gut biome is well balanced and in order. And ketonatal development. There are some heartbreaking studies coming out right now, particularly out of places that have really heavy lockdowns during the COVID period, largely because children weren't able to go outside nearly as much. And what you ended up with is kids with less diverse gut biomes. And what you're seeing is increased anxiety and all kinds of neurodensity issues. So fascinating, really, really cool stuff. And that's just gut brain stuff. So much more to say about this. But for now, that's the last lecture. And I think that we're within pretty good time. I'll stop here and say, hey, do we have any questions? Do we have anything to say? What do we reckon? How was I'll just get general feedback. How was this lecture in comparison to the others? What do you guys think? Is it enjoyable, or did I just kill you all with too much information?
Again, it's been able to, like Polly said, like being able to contextualize it for yourself.
Yeah.
Like I get it all, and it's all really interesting. It's just being able to like,
yeah, put it all into action.
put it,
Yeah. Well, the thing that I said at the beginning is important. This is embodiment theory, like talking about embodiment as a method of approach. This is a theoretical approach. So I've given you guys a scalpel. Take all these lecture slides and listen to this lecture again, or do whatever you like with it. But if you can't find something in the real world that you can use, you can dissect with this approach, then it's me who's delivering it badly, because this is really effective in terms of trying to understand things a little better. So yeah, take it out. I've now given you this tool. Have a look outside and take a look at it. I tried to include as much functional stuff as I could. I love the control stuff, the way that the auto regulation, the habitus of self discipline is a really good one to observe. But also, I mean, look at people's diets and biomes. Look at in culture things like squatting. Take a look at the way that we're still committed to the divide, all the way from Platonic ideal to Christian purity to Descartes' sort of mind-body stuff, and see how common it is. Like people who think that the mind is above the body and the body is dirty, while as the mind is pure, like that conception.
I think I have an argument a lot within my own mind without putting it onto people. But if you're taking a binary perspective on anything, and that's where we tend to put arguments all the time.
Yeah.
You just miss so much. You miss so much other stuff.
Yeah, it's the grace. So much is in the grace. Absolutely. Hang on, I'll continue asking you guys questions, but I'll give you a bit of room so that this isn't recording. How do I unshare? My control panel's disappeared. There we go. There we go. And I am stopping recording.